esteemed co-host Cynthia Johnson is off today. So to John Baldoni's point, it is Melissa Swift and I. We're doing this alone today, but that's okay. That we're going to be all right. I was just telling Melissa before we came on that I get to ask more questions, so it's okay with me. But I do miss Cynthia and her wit and her great questions. But we've got an amazing guest today that I've been looking forward to having on the show, Melissa Swift. She is an innovative organizational consultant. Her work is well known, but she's got a book out that we want to talk about. And the book is called Work Here Now. Think like a human and build like a powerhouse workplace, and build a powerhouse workplace. I can't speak today. But she's been a leader at Korn Ferry, Capgemini, Mercer, Deloitte. So she knows what she's talking about. So tune in, listen up. Melissa, welcome to Bestseller Live.
Thank you. I am excited to be here. I mean, any podcast that's about books that matter, I am just pumped to be included.
Well, thank you. You've got some really interesting things to talk about. I want to talk about the new project you're working on and get as much as you can share. I know some of it is top secret, but I do want to get some of those nuggets today as well. But let's get into Work Here Now. This book has been recognized by Thinkers 50, Porchlight, McKinsey, as a groundbreaking resource. What was the central problem you wanted to solve when you set out to write this book?
Yeah, it's interesting because this book, like many books, it started out as a really different book in my head. I was going to write this fun, jokey account of all the kooky stuff we do at work, right? Like we do agile and it's weird, and we do hot desking and it's weird, and you get enough years in a corporate workplace and you've got a wonderful collection from, your own experience, organizations you've consulted with, all this weird, kooky stuff. And then COVID hit, right? And it really changed my lens from let's talk about what's weird about work to let's try to get a bead on what fundamentally might not be working day to day. And is there a deeper problem to be solved? And what are some data-driven perspectives on what that problem looks like and what we could do to address it? I think, like many people, I'm good old Gen X. And I think a lot of us Gen Xers feel like something funky has happened to work during our lifetimes. Yeah. And so this was a little bit of a quest to start figuring that out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was having a conversation the other day, and this is so off topic, but worth, I think, part of the discussion is, I've got a 21-year-old who's a senior now in college and a 20-year-old who's a sophomore. And I was in a conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about how they're not going to enter the same kind of workplace that we entered. Right. And in fact, their path to, we started at entry level jobs and we worked our way through the sort of the maze and the corporate structure. And that path it's not the same for them now. And we had big changes sort of when we were in our 30s and our, 40, but they're dealing with this massive change really much earlier in work than we did it. So I just thought that was interesting. But what is going on then? You got into this. What's going on in work? And tell me about it.
So I would analogize it to think about the early industrial revolution, what it was like to be a worker then. It was not a lot of fun. People died on the job pretty routinely. It just kind of stank. Factories would just catch on fire and machines would lop people's body parts. It was not cool.
No.
We're living through a version of that right now. And it's not as obvious because it's not necessarily threats to our physical safety, but we've engineered work in a lot of ways that are kind of threats to our mental/neurological safety.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of what's going on. And that's a bit of where you get some of the generational clash. Because if you're me, I came into the workforce in 1998. I'm a bit of a boiled frog. I have lived through this change, right? But if you're, your kids, my daughter's a bit younger, she's 11, and they come fresh into a world of work that really, again, has some of the safety guardrails are a bit off, and we've done things a bit strangely. And because we're using new technologies, we don't fully understand how to protect human workers from them yet.
Yeah.
And so they come in and they're like, oh, holy wow, like, what is this? And we're like, oh, new generation at work, they're so weird. But having a completely normal reaction to weird stuff that we're just used to. So that's a little bit of my theory on what's going on. I mean, I'll give you like a really super practical example. As a for instance, when you were doing agrarian work back in, let's say, the Middle Ages, the working day had a natural rhythm. If you got tired, you'd stop because you were tired, and you stopped, and you couldn't pick any more corn because you couldn't pick any more corn, or it would be raining one day and you couldn't pick corn at all. Today, with the modern Outlook calendar, you can fill every second with meetings. Technology has convinced us we can work in a certain way, but we're still neurologically and physically wired the same way we were in the Middle Ages. It's not like our bodies have really evolved to keep up in a meaningful way. So that's a bit of what we're up against, is that in certain ways, work is not kind of felicitous for human workers. And you could say, well, okay, fine, but what about the shareholders? Well, the shareholders wouldn't want us to work this way either, because it's also not productive. And I think that's the point we need to kind of keep making as well.
Yeah, that's so true. You talk about 3 kinds of broken work. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so, one kind is, and we're seeing a lot of this with Gen AI at the moment, just misunderstood work.
Okay.
That, where your boss doesn't understand what you do all day. And that is, in an environment of rapid skills change, that is shockingly pervasive. And it's not, by the way, a negative comment on your boss. It's kind of in the nature of managing work where the underlying skills are changing fast and the technology is changing fast. But it creates all these problems within an organization, because if I'm your boss and I don't understand the work you're doing, how do I manage it properly? How do I manage you properly? How do I manage teams properly? So misunderstood is one. Intensified is another. And intensified work is basically where we've just packed too much in. So that could be too many tasks in too little time. That could be work that's too interdependent. So, when you hear Jamie Dimon ranting about why do I have to go through 17 committees, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about interdependent work, right? And it's really scary. You got the CEO of a major corporation. If he feels afflicted by it, imagine how everybody else feels. Like, none of us feel very good. Right. And also, very emotionally inflected work can also be intensified. So if you're the customer service representative, where a chatbot took all the basic stuff you used to do, and now you only talk to customers who are really mad, because by the time somebody's speak to a human, speak to a human, speak to a human, right? You only deal with angry people all day long. That's intensified work as well. So that's another category of broken work. And then finally we have, and this is kind of like my favorite or my anti-favorite, performative work. And that's not work at all. But this goes on like wildfire in knowledge work, right? Where you're just doing the performance of work. Like, look, I am sending all the emails. I'm in the meeting talking about that, right? We've all worked with this person. And it's terrible. It's a performance. Again, it's a performance management nightmare, right? Because a lot of times those are the people who get paid at the end of the year. And you're going, wait, I did all the things. All they did was talk about it. But again, if you look at those 3 kinds of work for different reasons, you want to correct for all 3. But part of what I was thinking in the book is we just need a language to talk about this stuff, because, right, we feel it, but until you name it, you can't solve it.
Yeah. How do you, as a leader, how do you do that? I mean, that's not easy.
Some of it is you have to kind of get down to the reality of work. And we don't like to get down to the reality of work. We are actually, in many ways, we create a lot of mechanisms to not look at the day-to-day work people do and what actually produces results. Because if you really knew these are the exact activities that produce results, right? Then you shunt performative work to the side because you're like, no, that doesn't produce any results. You prune down intensified work because you're like, no, you're doing 37 tasks there and only 7 of them produce results, right? And then, of course, you solve for misunderstood work because you actually understand it. But we're moving at this point at such a complexity and such a pace in many organizations that we've actually lost the beat on. I mean, think about, again, back to our agrarian example. You understood what needed to happen for the harvest.
Yeah.
Today, if you ask somebody who's, leading a major department in a major company, what exactly needs to happen? I think they'd give you maybe a 60% answer. And that gap, that 40% of understanding the work, is where everything's going wrong.
Yeah, and you'd get a different answer if you asked another manager or another leader or another, right? So that's the thing.
Different.
Right. And that I've done that exercise in my consulting practice, and seeing the reaction of CEOs when their exec team gives different answers to the vision and different answers to what they're supposed to deliver. It's really, really, really interesting. I'm writing the book. I was telling you about this before we came on, and the book is called Fundamentals, and it's about self-talk and how a leader's self-talk actually impacts team performance. And we talk about the monster, and I'd love you talk about the work anxiety monster.
Yes.
And so I talk about that a little bit, because I find that fascinating.
Oh, and by the way, I love that you're calling out the way that self-talk translates through to the people you interact with, because that is a great subject for a book. And I think much needed. I think in many ways we are our own worst enemies, but we don't realize we're hurting other people too. And it's a powerful point. So this is a bit of what led me to talk about the work anxiety monster. Is I was like, what is going on? So I sort of worked backward from, I'm like, I see all this frantic activity in companies. And again, you see it too, right? So much of the activity is fundamentally unproductive, right? It's just activity for activity's sake. So then I'm in there asking why? Why are we doing activity for activity's sake? It's not like any of us are enjoying it. Everybody's burnt out, exhausted. Every consultant I talk to is like, yeah, I've spoken to somebody in the C-suite within the last week who is in tears. So why are we doing this? Yeah. And what I really came to is it's the work anxiety monster. And it's very related to, theory X and theory Y management. Either we believe that people need to be told to do the right thing, or we believe that people will do the right thing inherently. And if you start in with the assumption that people need to be told to do the right thing, that they're basically lazy and slow, and you need to, and this is where a lot of scientific management, Taylorism comes from, like there's a grand tradition of bad management thinking, just like this,
Oh, yeah.
I stand over them and tell them what to do. And that's the work anxiety monster. It's the little monster in our head going, people are lazy, people are slow, or even, to your point about self-talk, you're lazy, you're slow. I find myself doing it to me, and I literally wrote a whole thing about it, and I still do it. So it's if we can quiet down that anxious voice. And I think that's where, again, you're part of, there's a whole group of us kind of talking about some version of that, about shut down the anxious voice, because the anxious voice is hurting people. And that's, that's a powerful, and I'm now very excited to read your book, because I think this is a deep vein that, again, organizations need to drill more into, because we act like everything is perfectly rational. And if you're familiar with, I'm going to get a Phineas Gage, right? So the rail worker who got the spike through the eye, and what happened was, it cut off his sort of emotional wiring in his brain, and then he couldn't make rational decisions. Like he couldn't decide red pajamas versus blue pajamas, for instance. Right. And what it proved was, neurologically, there is no separate rational and emotional wiring in the brain. And that's part of the admission that we need to make as we think about concepts like all this anxious self-talk and the anxiety monster, is that, we think that we're setting everything up so rationally, but a lot of it is just like bad, weird, emotional decisions that we could and should unwind.
Do you think it's hard? I remember my co-authors and I really struggled with, who this book was for. And the reason we struggled with it is, how do you talk to your team about emotion and anxiety? And I mean, it's a danger zone for management, right? And so how do we do that? Do you have any insight into how we can, as leaders, can talk to our people about the anxiety monster? How do we do that?
Yeah, I know. I love that question, because it's one I've wrestled with a version of that myself. Absolutely. I think some of it is, number one, you have to open up the space by talking about your own emotions, and starting from a place of transparency about your own emotions, your own anxiety. Like I have found in the leadership roles that I've held, just personally saying, I am anxious about this. This makes me anxious. Here's what I am worried about. This is something that I worry about that I know to be irrational.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Communicating that, people are like, whoa, Melissa, like I feel this wave of psychological safety coming over me. And I'm like, guys, this is basics. But I think, again, there's a tradition of leaders needing to be kind of extremely, sort of corporate, poker faced, et cetera. But it really starts with like showing that you have a little self-understanding, self-compassion, and being, I think, a bit confessional about how anxiety operates for you. Once you do that, I think the floodgates open a bit. But I agree with you. It's in some ways talking about emotional inflection of business decisions is the ultimate taboo.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're taking a risk really trying to focus on corporates, but I do think that it's a necessary conversation for us to have. I still struggle with how we do that, but I think it's important. You just did a study on how the workplace feels overwhelmed. 75% of the workplace feels overwhelmed. How do we rethink all of this? I mean, I feel like we're at this inflection point where we really have to reevaluate all, the way we work and how we organize our team. I think, it's sort of, how do we start? Because that actually, I think, takes courage from a leader to say it's not working, right? I mean, I was talking to a company yesterday and a team leader, and she's got the highest turnover in the company. And we started the conversation about rethinking how they organize the teams, because they've done it the same for the last 20 years. That nothing has changed in the organizational and how they have split up work, how they organize their work. And so how do we start having those conversations?
I think for me, the mindset shift, because this is really tough stuff. Some of these problems are a bit ownerless, right? And that's what you constantly feel up against trying to address them. The problem of
she was at a loss. She was at absolute loss.
Because she doesn't own all the decisions that add up to her situation. It's totally fair. So to your point, but you're asking exactly the right question, right? What is the stuff that I, as an individual leader, might have the agency to drive? And I think there's some simple stuff to be addressed. I think number one, just like believe in efficient frontiers. Stop believing in infinity. And what I mean by that is there is a zone of best performance for a person, for a team, for an organization. And it's here. It's not necessarily all the way out here. We have been led to believe, with technology, anything is possible, right? And you can also optimize infinitely. So believe in efficient frontiers, believe in slack and redundancy. It's interesting. For my next book, I was interviewing somebody who was a really, really experienced leader in the supply chain space. And I said, oh my gosh, you could probably teach a master class in chaos. How do you deal with chaos in the supply chain space, right? It's like the most physical manifestation. And he's like, extra warehouses, extra trucks, right? Capacity. And it's fascinating to me because when I say we, I'm like, this is me taking the blame, right? Consultants have done this. You can just optimize the heck out of everything. If you see one extra anything, get rid of it.
Right.
Lose a bit of that mentality, right? And once you say it can't be 20 million things, it can't be optimized to heck and beyond, right? Then things start to pull back and you start to say, okay, we can have maybe, there was a great German study on complexity where they were talking about the fact that American phone numbers have 7 digits for a reason. We struggle with numbers more than 7. So if you have 19 priorities for your team, just bring the number down. There's some brute force stuff there.
Yeah. One of my, that's so true. One of my favorite ideas from the book is this idea of couples counseling for humans and technology. What? Do tell.
Relevant today more than ever. So, again, this is one where I think a little bit of, the truth is curative. So we do a lot of myth making around technology. Technology is going to enable us to do all these brilliant things, and it's going to help us lay off half our workforces. That's the current line. With all this rhetoric. The reality of technology is a lot of the time it doesn't work. A lot of the time it's poorly designed. A lot of the time you have individual great technologies that don't work together. or systems that don't talk to each other. Right. So there's a lot of friction in the technology space that we almost culturally refuse to acknowledge. And that's what gets in the way of that wonderfully fluid partnership, or that great marriage between humans and tech, right? It's like tech's not, just like if you went into couples counseling, you're like, well, my spouse is perfect, like, and I'm perfect, you're not going to get anywhere. So admitting, but in the human tech relationship, we're always like, tech is perfect and human beings are all over the place. And again, if you went into couples counseling that way, you're like, well, I'm a hot mess, but no, that doesn't work. So admitting there's issues on both sides and then actively negotiating that relationship, I think that's what's going to get us somewhere. And that's why I really hate a lot of the rhetoric around AI right now, where they're like, it's coming for your job. Like, even if that's true, which it's not, even if that's true, that's unhelpful to keep saying it.
Right. 100%.
And then you're like, oh, why are people not adopting it? Well, you scared the heck out of them. What are you doing? Be sensible.
Right. I actually was in one of those meetings a couple of weeks ago, and I walked out when the meeting wrapped. I said to the CEO, you really can't say in the beginning of the meeting that it's going to take jobs, and then this AI project that is got to have actually complete adoption in the organization. You can't push for the adoption of that, but then talk about the future of AI and how it's going to, disrupt and change the workforce. And like, you got to think about, very unhelpful. Very, very unhelpful.
Wait, it's not what history teaches us. I actually, in my next little writing project, I do a case study on GPS and London cab drivers. And it's interesting because there was a meaningful lag between the introduction of GPS and the actual decline in the number of London black cabs. And there's a whole bunch of other factors and timing. Wow. And when you really look at the case study, it's not a single technology that disrupts you. It's generally like a company or a cohort of companies using a whole bunch of technologies. I mean, Uber has, for instance, thousands of patents. That's not one technology blowing you up, right? And it wasn't GPS, So when you look at the real history of how jobs get disrupted, it looks a lot different than what's being described right now. And I think we got to engage with the reality. And there's similar stuff with horses and automobiles. There's casebook in this regard, and the current rhetoric's totally off.
So I got to talk about your new book coming out in 2026 without giving too much away. Are you building on? Is it a book of building on the ideas from Work Here Now, or tell us a little bit, or tell us what you can?
It's designed to answer the question that everybody asked me after Work Here Now. So, inevitably, everyone had the same reaction where they're like, Melissa, this is a really good characterization of a lot of what's going on in modern workplaces. Like, you really you kind of hit some nerves here. They're like, great. What do I do personally? Not what does my organization do? What can I do? I maybe being an individual contributor, I being a senior leader. What can I do? So that's what this book is really designed to address, is what is kind of the personal infrastructure and the way of understanding the world that will get you through and make you critically effective during it's hard to be good at your job these days. And I think we should admit that and strategize. And so it's really about, and it's interesting because I could have sort of gone in a lot of different directions from Work Here Now. There's a whole body of folks writing about, for instance, kind of like employee health and well-being. And that is a good, useful body of literature. And then there's people writing about kind of like corporate productivity. And that's more, there's some really good stuff in there and then some really toxic stuff in there, right? It's a mixed bag. But I was kind of like, let's talk about this really basic feeling of, you come home from a day at work, you want to feel like you got something done. That is a good feeling. That is like this just core human need. Like, I'm good at what I do. And I was like, okay, that's where this book's going to go. That's what I'm going to focus on. And then, so it's the successor to Work Here Now, kind of in that vein of like, all right, work's weird and messy. Yeah. What do I do? Yeah,
I love that. And it's so true, right? I love the question, how was your day? But asking more like, do you feel good about what you got done today? Right.
Yeah.
And that's a great, I can't wait to read it. I got so excited about having you on and talking about the book that we didn't talk about your work at Anthrome Insight, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us about where people can get the book. And I'm sure, I don't know if you're speaking and consulting and all that kind of good stuff, which I think you are. Tell us about all that.
Yeah, all of the things. So, the most easily answered questions, you can get the book wherever books are sold. And please, follow or connect to me on LinkedIn. That's where, I'll be putting out announcements about the new book. And in general, just like communicating, I share like the German complexity study. I share fun research I've found and all kinds of great, highlight other books that really, have enlivened, my interests, et cetera, et cetera. And then Anthrome, we work on these topics, right? How can individuals, teams, and organizations be effective in a really complicated, weird, highly technologized world of work? And I think, what we bring to the table is a very data and evidence driven view of how to do that, but also just a very pragmatic one too. What I saw as a gap in corporate consulting is, what I like to call the last page of the presentation. All this great analysis, all this great stuff, and then the recommendations are like womp womp. And so the mission of Anthrome is getting in there, and it's almost Freudian, right? It's like, how do you break your organization's patterns or your team's patterns, right? What are those circuit breakers that are going to get you to a way of working that's actually different and actually effective? And how do we do in a crisp way that diagnosis and treatment? And I speak about this, and I do workshops and all of the fun things. But as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. But also, I think it's important to be engaging around these issues. Like there's a version of this that could be very dull and depressing, and I try not to be that.
Yeah, I was gonna say you don't have that problem, and that's okay.
I'm trying not.
Yeah. I like the enthusiasm. So it's important work, Melissa, thank you for being on the show. You should check this book out. I think with all the challenges we face as leaders today, and I know we have a lot of leaders and founders and managers that listen to this program. Pick up a copy of this. If you haven't read the book, it's a great read. It's actually a very easy read, but I think if you want to get better, if you want to figure out how to see around the corners that we have to see around today and deal with the rapid change, this book, Work Here Now, is a must read. Melissa, we're going to have you back on next year when this book comes out. When the new book comes out, I'm sure it will be just as good. So thank you very much. Thank you for spending some time with us here today on Bestseller Live. And we will see you next week.
Thank you so much.